morning, everybody, and welcome to the Marin Economic Briefing. My name is Mike Blakely, and I'm the CEO of the Marin Economic Forum. MEF is a nonprofit public benefit organization that provides data, analysis, and strategy development in support of Marin County's economic vitality. You can find out more about our organization by visiting our website at www.marineconomicforum.org. And while you're on the website, I encourage you to subscribe to our communications so that you can be sure to be invited to future events like these. The Marin Economic Briefing is intended to be a short 30-minute presentation of key economic data that the Marin Economic Forum is viewing to really try to understand the health of our economy, especially in the face of COVID-19. To help us do that, I'm be joined this morning by our chief economist, Dr. Rob Eiler, a well-known expert on the North Bay economy. And we're going to walk everyone through what we see as the key economic data points that we are watching in order to truly understand how our economy is faring. This information, as some of you know, is not always easy to find, certainly not always easy to understand. So Dr. Eiler is excellent at helping us really truly understand what the numbers mean. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we proceed. This is being recorded. So for those of you that may have to leave early or want to share a link to the recording with your colleagues, that will be available to you by email following this. The second thing is we always try to handle questions. Please put them in the chat box, but we also do like to keep it to 30 minutes and let you get on with your day. So these briefings, this is now the third one that we've done. And for those of you that follow the Marin Economic Forum and do subscribe to our newsletters, you will note that in September, we made the observation that the impacts of COVID-19 on the Marin economy are actually more severe in some cases relative to those impacts at the statewide level. And that's unique because normally when you look at key indicators for Marin County versus the state, Marin County is superior. Those include things like median income, educational attainment, even lifespan. But now what we're starting to notice with 6 months of data is there are some emerging trends where Marin County is not performing as well as the state. Those are very specifically in job losses and unfortunately in the case rate among our Latino population. Now in the case of job losses and the impacts, what we're seeing is that our small business community, and especially those that are largely concentrated in the personal services sector, are a main reason of why Marin County is having more severe impacts. And that is because of social policy that has not allowed those businesses to operate at their full capacity or even open at all. And so in the next few months, we have to make really careful observation of how those businesses are faring, because those are the main engine in our economy. And that's very different than taking a look at statewide. And so that's why when you see numbers at the state that look better than they do here in Marin, that it's explained by the composition of our economy. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Rob, who's going to take us through these key data points. Again, we like to look at things happening at the national level, the state level, and then we'll walk everybody through what's happening in Marin by using our Marin Recovery data tool. So Rob, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Folks, thank you for coming this morning. Mike, you can see my screen? I'm going to assume we're good to go. Here we go. So folks, I'm going to start with just a brief overview. Jobs are slowly coming back at the national level, and tourism is one of those spaces though that has still struggled. And so one of the things we're watching very closely is how the US and California economies evolved along the lines of our tourism season ending, and also just seeing what parts of the economy are still going to be dragged into lower levels of jobs and ultimately higher levels of unemployment because we haven't seen a full tourism comeback. Marin County's actually done relatively well, and we'll see those data in a minute. Another unfortunate piece of uncertainty is that we have a contested presidential election at the same time we're in recession, at the same time that we've still got concerns about emerging from a social crisis with respect to COVID-19. Our forecasts, as you're going to see a little bit about in a minute, have not really taken into account any major aftermath of the presidential elections, and it'll be intriguing to see in October if we see some changes in that. But for the California economy and hopefully for Marin County, we need to get through these two periods. One, the presidential election, and finalize who's going to be the new president, and then 2, to get through the fall and winter where we should expect some rise in cases. And for better or for worse, for Marin County, moving to that second tier is going to help the things that Mike described get slightly better. But we're starting to see some closures of major cities in Europe. You may have seen in the news that Madrid is back in basic shutdown mode. And is that a harbinger of what we might be facing here in the fall and winter? We will see. Equity markets are likely to react to those things across the board as a way of thinking about investor confidence, and whether or not households follow suit if investor confidence wanes is an open question for forecasts to come. The New York Federal Reserve does what it calls a nowcast every week, and it's essentially using big data to try to look at 7 or 8 different indices, and you can see those in the names at the very top. But the Q3 and Q4 forecast, the Q3 just ended yesterday, Q4 is now starting today, but there's this trail that happens behind it, and you can see that for the third quarter, it's about 14% up from the 14% up from last year. The point there is that growth has continued in the third quarter, but notice that initially things had risen up very quickly in the beginning of the third quarter, and then this forecast somewhat flattened over summer. And a lot of that's because we saw social policies become more restrictive in certain states, and job growth, while happening, was not happening in a robust fashion everywhere. But that growth rate is amazing and historic. The fourth quarter, as you're going to see in a little bit, is moderated somewhat, but you can see that quick rise and then some flattening. 5.5% is the current prediction, even though we're still very early in terms of how the momentum goes from third quarter to fourth quarter. But most of the forecasts expect somewhere in a 5.5% range for growth in the fourth quarter, really just keeping on the momentum and assuming, and this is key, and this kind of goes back to some of the points Mike made right off the top, is that we are expecting a continuous recovery. And if we don't get that, or we have some underlying issues that the data either somewhat mask, or depending on the composition of the local economy might be different in Marin County versus the state or the greater Bay Area, we're going to be watching very closely to see if the national forecasts continue to wane a little bit, closer down to maybe 3 or 4% for the fourth quarter. And so much of that depends on how the consumers react to the changes in expectations with respect to the election and ultimately to the caseload that we may see rise over the next few months. And in fact, we should expect to rise. It really just a matter of whether or not it detriments our economic lives further. You can see that movement here. Now, one of the pieces of labor data that we have now moved to is continued unemployment insurance claims, or the number of weeks in total that we're paying unemployment insurance. And these data are weekly from January 2020 to September 2020 to really give you a sense of the fast movement into unemployment insurance that workers took early in the crisis, and then the contrast between the US and California. So the blue data are the US, and this is kind of a classic way of seeing recession begin, even though the speed of this is somewhat historic. We walk up the ladder as a lot of people go on to unemployment insurance, and the number of weeks we're paying are very high. You can see it peaked just about 25 million weeks worth of unemployment insurance sometime in early May. And then it's been sliding down with a nice gradient ever since, even though that gradient, notice, is not going down in any so-called V-shaped pattern. It's actually going in somewhat of a modified V, that we got a nice little kick in the initial stage of getting to the peak and then starting to go down. But that slide has moderated somewhat and is more classic of recovery from recession rather than just a snapback as if this was a natural disaster and we suddenly are going back to work. That is not happening. California, unfortunately, has seen a little bit more flat activity in these data, where we saw an initial rise. We saw some violence in these data here in the month of May as we were trying to figure out what our social policies were going to look like across the state. But the summer's been relatively flat, and that's because people have gone on and off basically in equal parts, if not the last couple of weeks, picking back up on the number that are going on. And that's because California has some relative exposure in risky industries, tourism, other services, meaning personal services where we have to have proximity. We aren't having events or attractions open in California, which reverberates throughout the state, especially in places like Los Angeles County, which is still one of the highest unemployment rates in the nation with respect to metropolitan areas. So we're watching very closely to see if these data for California also slide over the next few weeks down. We need that to happen to truly feel like recovery is beginning. For the consumer, the University of Michigan does a monthly index of consumer confidence through surveys. And these data are an index from using May 2019 is equal to 100. And you can see these are the last 3 recessions, and these are monthly data from January 2000 to September 2020. The 3 recessions, the dot-com, the Great Recession, and now our current recession are shown here in the shaded areas. That circled portion on the far right is where we've been since basically the COVID-19 crisis seized up consumer confidence. forced it to fall quickly in April. And then we've been sort of wobbling ever since during the summer because the uncertainty in our economy has not quite been alleviated by policy yet. And this is also classic. The idea that policy, though very robust, was going to lead to a V-shaped recovery is very tricky historically and theoretically for economists. So watch a lot of rhetoric in the presidential debates, in the vice presidential debates by some economists who are willing to put their foot out there that this is not going to be that big of a deal, historically speaking, and we will turn the corner relatively quickly. The consumer's confidence might be the one linchpin piece in actually getting some forceful recovery once it starts. To give you a sense of how California looks with respect to unemployment rates, and just as one gauge of what's going on comparatively speaking in other states, you can see the darker states on this map are ones that are still struggling with job loss. The lighter ones are ones that have recovered more quickly. In August, which are the latest data, the US was down in a seasonally adjusted unemployment rate, this is the headline unemployment rate. So it does not include the marginally employed or those that are temporarily employed or part-time. 8.4% unemployment, which is severely down or significantly down, I'm sorry, from the peaks. California at 11.4, New York at 12.5, Illinois at 11. Those are the darker states on this map, and we'll get to Nevada in just a second, but Utah, Nebraska, and Idaho are examples of states that are now almost back to where they were pre-COVID, but the number of cases in those states were not as high as in places like California and New York. The economies were not as affected, and the job losses were not as severe. So they've recovered a little bit more quickly, and the key there is whether or not they continue at that pace or they see some job losses as we go into fall and winter because the rest of the economy starts to suffer through higher caseloads. Nevada's still at 13.2, but they peaked at 28.2 early in this crisis. So they are down as their economy is opened back up. But again, it's critical that these states see continued momentum out of the crisis, and we shouldn't just look at a snapshot. And once again, these data do not include the part-time or self-employed. So that's another bunch of data that we don't really measure very well as economists, frankly, and that this crisis has exposed some of those cracks in terms of watching the data. For California, here's the some selected industries in terms of job loss. You can see farming took a hit, but some of that may be fire related in August versus last August because of the timing of our regional fires this year. Otherwise, we've seen some get back in terms of job losses. The job losses for most industries are getting somewhat smaller versus last year, though leisure and hospitality, which is the amalgam of hotels, bars, and restaurants and attractions in California, is still way down. Over about 3 out of 10 workers that had a job last year do not have a job this year. And other services, those nail salons, hair salons, and fitness centers mainly, are still down almost 25%. So this is a way of thinking about what's been lost across California. What we want to do now is talk about Marin County using what we just saw as macro context. And with the help of Mike, we developed what we're calling the Marin Recovery Data Tool, with the idea that these data should provide some guidance as to whether or not we have started a recovery and how good the recovery has been. So these are updated through August in most cases. This is the continued claims data at the county level. So one thing that you're going to see, thinking about that California and US graph we just looked at, that these places in California are going to show very similar activity. A peak, a somewhat slow slide down, and then a little bit of a pop toward the last few weeks. And you can see this is Marin County. So we have seen some alleviation of the problem, but not by much. Here's Napa, San Francisco. San Francisco is still struggling. Solano County, Mendocino County is also still struggling. Sonoma County doing actually a little bit better overall, but not the last few weeks. Here's California, which is basically somewhat of a repeat of the data we just saw. And then here's the US. So California still is a lot of people on unemployment. And remember, these data are about the net flow on and off unemployment insurance. So it's one way of gauging in more of a real-time way and in a point estimate way how many people have a job or not in terms of the original job loss from COVID-19 or in any recession situation. So we got a lot of work to do still. These data suggest that. Here's job losses looking back at last year. So this is also a mirror image of the graph we saw before, but I'm going to walk you through a few months to watch the evolution of the crisis and then some recovery momentum. This is April. This is where most of us as economists think that we basically troughed, even though in May we saw also some pretty decent downward activity, but some pickup. So these data are comparing the previous year's month to this year's month and the job loss from last year. May, June, July, and here's August. So August, you can see that we didn't get as much in gains in July and August, even though professional and business services have picked up. Government jobs have remained relatively flat now and maybe had some overall change because we've seen a little bit of hiring to deal with public health. Construction has flattened a little bit, but has remained relatively strong throughout this period, as is manufacturing. Manufacturing got a pretty quick bounce back, which has been good for Marin County, especially in the biotech side. But other industries are still somewhat around the middle portion of the original losses, which suggests that there's still time, or there's still recovery momentum that we need to gain access to, and we're not quite there yet. A lot of people like to run to the unemployment rate. I talked earlier about some of the caveats, but I want to show you a comparison about the evolution with respect to Marin County. There's Marin County after a seasonal adjustment in unemployment, and here's California. So we are normally moving a little bit ahead in Marin County of the state average. But the key here is to notice that even with that quick change, and this is where you're hearing a lot of the quote unquote V-shaped recovery idea. Remember, this is not counting the self-employed or the part-time employed. Second, this is based on a labor force that has contracted. So if you take the contracted labor force and say that those folks are ostensibly unemployed because they've decided to either walk away or have retired for the time being and have stopped working one way or the other, we're not utilizing those folks as assets in our economy for productivity. These data are likely understating the problem, but also notice that where we are in Marin County is still about the same height as the height of the Great Recession. So we've got some work to do. While these data are showing improvement from the worst case this year, they're not necessarily suggesting we are in full-blown recovery yet. We look at housing. Housing has been seen as kind of a bright light in all this. Two ways I want you to think about housing are the following. One, this is listing prices. And so one way to think about listing prices is on the supply side of the housing market and how confident home owners are in selling their home at prices that are relatively the same or higher than the previous months. And it's really about trend. So a lot of economists expected to see listing prices sag very quickly with the idea that folks are going to want to liquidate the wealth that they've gained access in their homes, cash out, and then have that cash for flexibility about where they're going to land on the other side of this crisis, especially if they had to move due to job loss. But for the most part in California, which is in contrast to the continued claims for unemployment insurance and generally speaking, the height of unemployment rates, we haven't seen much change in homes for sale, but I'll talk about that in the next slide a little more deeply. Just walk through some places here. So this is the evolution in the last few months, and that shaded area is really the post-COVID situation with respect to how homeowners are seeing the value of their homes when they list them. There's Sonoma County, a little bit of a kick up the last couple of months. There's Napa County, who's really seen some action, and anecdotally on the street in Napa County, a lot of that is tech moving out of the Bay Area, or tech workers moving out of the Bay Area. California, overall on average, has shown pretty good momentum. And San Francisco, in reverse idea of Napa, has actually seen a slide. And we kind of expected that, but that could also be because prices are relatively high. And with the idea of wanting to liquidate, you had to lower prices just to get people into the market, given all the uncertainty. However, this is just the supply side of the market. How it actually realizes itself is the next slide, which is median home prices after the sales have happened. And now I'm going to look at the percentage change over the last couple of years. This, you can see Marin County on the far right-hand side at 6.1% gain in home values, and this is actually as of August 2020, not July. I apologize for that labeling problem. 6.1% as of August 2020 compared to August 2019, and not much different from 2 years ago, which suggests the previous year from August 2019 to August 2018, not much changed in Marin County. You can see San Mateo and Sonoma County actually had negative 2 years, and the last year's really picked up the momentum there. So we have not seen much change in housing, but here's a huge caveat about that. If you had mortgage payment deferment or some adjustment that allowed you to not have to lose the cash flow and potentially not have to make a panic sale based on a job loss, that might just be delaying the inevitable. So we're watching closely to see if we have higher rental vacancy, which provides the opportunity for homeowners to sell their home but stay local, and we see a fade in the deferment policies that are out there that would then force some marginal change in whether or not you can afford to stay in your home and pay your mortgage, and have delinquency in payments start to rise, and ultimately have foreclosures and notices of default rise, which are normally harbingers of housing market problems in terms of maintaining median home prices. So we're watching all those closely. Banks and credit unions are still holding pretty firm, and the federal government's being very concerned about unleashing a lot of delinquencies on the market. But watch for that evolution, especially after the presidential election and when Congress makes a deal. and they will make a deal at some point to get that next round of funding. It just depends on how big and how many strings are attached. Building permits are a way of looking at the evolution of construction. These are just residential housing units. So you can see this is the evolution in Marin County since 2002. And I don't really show you the recession because it should be relatively obvious where the Great Recession lies and the evolution after the dot-com recession. And you can see on the far right-hand side, I circled just that little bit of a kick up in a 12-month sum. This is basically like a 12-month run rate in the total amount of building permits. There's a big slowdown when COVID started, but it looks like we're starting to kick back up again. This is a good sign for construction in Marin County. We need to keep this momentum going. If A, we want to build more housing units and alleviate what will be another housing crisis coming up once we get clear of this recession and ultimately have recovery momentum. But the second is this keeps construction workers employed, especially because this is where most of the action is, whether it's single family or multifamily units with respect to a new home construction and overall construction momentum. To wrap up my side of it today, this is the employment data of thinking about folks that live in Marin County. So I've kind of alluded to these data. These are not seasonally adjusted, but 7% is the unemployment rate in Marin County is sort of stated in the headline news, where 11.6 is the stated rate for California. If you go up the ladder, you see changes in the labor force. And to me, the real power of these data is in the labor force change. Generally in recession, we see a contraction in the labor force. This is actually a smaller contraction than the Great Recession. And that's because, folks, and I want to leave you with this, a lot of the job loss has been temporary work or temporary layoffs, not permanent job loss yet. So a graph I sometimes show in the macro portion is the amount of permanent job loss. We haven't seen that really jump into the economy yet, but if that starts to happen over fall and winter, these numbers are going to change significantly for the US, California, and somewhat for Marin County. However, we are down from the peaks. Momentum is there, but there are some caveats to where we're going next. And so what I'm going to do now is I want to hand it back off to Mike, and he's going to talk more about some of the things that are going on in the street with respect to the ways to think about these data, but also what might be coming. So Mike, I will hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Rob. And there's just so much to unpack here. And so what we like to try to do is to finish these presentations with a little bit of analysis and share with you our observations based on how we see these things and really what it means going forward. So Rob, if you can go to the next slide. You know, the real question that we're asking right now is, are we in Marin County in recovery or not? Ironically, when we titled the Marin Recovery Data Tool, the thinking behind this was that there's going to be a recovery and we want to monitor how the pace of it. And now, if you look at the data, there are certain indicators that suggest that we may not have hit the bottom yet. And I know that's a sobering thought, but if you look at some of the things like consumer confidence moving up and down, you know, consumers are still feeling out how comfortable they are returning to their consumption patterns. And as we've stated many times, demand is going to be the key determinant of the recovery here. There's another data that wasn't presented by Rob by this group called Opportunity Insights at Harvard, and we've shared their information before. They're using numerous data sources to track the impact on small businesses. And just yesterday, they came out with their numbers of sort of a nationwide review of small business closures. There it is. Thank you, Rob. If you look to the far left, the Bay Area metropolitan region at 49%, that's more than twice the national median. So our small businesses in the Bay Area are being impacted significantly worse than the rest of the United States. Rob, if you want to go back to the previous slide. One of the key data points that Rob presented was the unemployment insurance claims. And that actually, Rob has noted before, is sort of a leading indicator to the unemployment rate tends to follow that. And so now the only real good news that I saw in what Rob presented was that the unemployment rate was ticking down. However, if you look at the unemployment insurance claims moving back up, that may suggest that the unemployment could actually move back up. And so, again, it's a sobering thought, but we may not have hit the bottom yet, and we need to be looking at these numbers to really see if we can talk about recovery or not. The home price increase is both good and bad. Obviously, for our homeowners, it's good. From a public tax revenue perspective, that's good because those transactions usually will relate to higher amounts. of revenues in terms of property tax or other fees on those transactions. But we were already facing an affordability issue in Marin County in the housing sector. And so now with home prices increasing, I wonder if that problem is going to be exacerbated and put more pressure on the housing issue. I also point to some really interesting data that came out of the Silicon Valley region, where they have, for the first time, seen a net migration outflow. That means more people leaving Silicon Valley than coming in. But what they did is they further drilled down and said, well, who's coming in? What they found was that the new arrivals to Silicon Valley, mostly because of the jobs that are there, but also because the cost of living, are really the affluent community. And so as we see home prices move up and the cost of living in Marin potentially increase generally, are we pricing out others in our community? The third thing that I'm very concerned with is the data that Rob showed on the civilian labor force. So for context, many of you were aware of the Marin County Business Retention and Expansion Project that MEF was implementing with a lot of partners like chambers and other business organizations. One of the key findings there, in fact, the key finding pre-pandemic, was that the #1 issue for employers in Marin County was finding talent. And part of the reason it was so hard to find talent is because we had already relied on an imported workforce. Now, this reduction in workforce, those are residents, those are not jobs, meaning that it's not somebody who lives in the East Bay that's coming in and now they're no longer working in Marin. These are Marin residents who have permanently exited the workforce, which means it's pressuring more our need to eventually import more workers when we get back to business. And so this is something we need to be watching very clearly. And then finally, I'll just leave it that we've been having this discussion since this began of, is this going to be a return to normal? Some people say there's going to be a new normal. So far, the data is not really revealing what a new normal might be in Marin County as it relates to the business sector. Rob didn't show this slide, but we know in the commercial real estate sector, prices have actually been on the increase and availability on the decrease as it relates to offices. So this notion that all of our office buildings were going to empty out and become, sit vacant for a while doesn't seem to be happening. We already had a high proportion of our residents working remotely prior to the pandemic, and certainly that number has increased. But we're also reading lots of reports and looking at surveys where the sentiment about working from home is changing pretty dramatically, where people have been through this for 6 months, but those key interconnectedness that you have in the office is becoming a more significant factor to the productivity side of things. And then, of course, the shift to digital that we are seeing so rapidly occur. Well, in certain sectors in Marin County, that was already happening, particularly on the retail side. And so as people want to go out and say, well, things are never going to be the same, or this is going to be forever changed, we don't know yet from the data what the new normal is going to look like. And certainly some of you listening in do have ideas on that. And we're always happy to have those ideas from you at MEF. But again, if we look around and talk with some of our partners out there, look at Transportation Authority of Marin, for example, they had noted that public transportation, particularly on buses, was already decreasing pre-pandemic, and we know that public transportation is something that's going to be slow to come back. So, we really don't have good enough data now to suggest what a new normal is, but we are watching for indications of that. So that's really all we have to share with you this morning, and I don't want to characterize this things as good or bad, but I do think that it's not clear that we're actually started the road to recovery. And so that means that MEF is going to have to continue to closely watch all these indicators that Dr. Eiler presented this morning. Again, I want to thank everybody. We have the number of participants of this is growing each time. So we appreciate that you're continuing to get the word out. And again, this will be available recorded for you to view and share with colleagues. And we have a very open door policy here. We want to hear from you, particularly if you have observations on what you are seeing in the economy. Please feel free to reach out to us. And we'll be preparing for the next one of these more than likely in November. Isn't that right, Rob?
Yes.
Okay, thanks there,
Sorry,
Rob.
I wasn't sure if I was on mute. My bad.
No problem. We're all used to that in Zoom. Rob, I'm going to leave it to you for any final comments.
Well, the best thing to say, folks, to wrap up is there's three big things to watch. One is the jobs. We need those jobs to come back. Second is that the forecasts do not really price in a lot of problems on the other side of the election and or a real surge in cases that undermine our ability to keep the economy open in fall and winter yet. Third is that if you think about the science, we should not expect a vaccine until at least spring or summer. So that uncertainty is going to remain with labor markets, consumers, and businesses, and to a certain extent, governments, going into the beginning of next year. So some of the things that lead to municipal budget problems, lead to rehiring decisions, that fog is still going to stay with us probably until March. So keep that in mind. And if things get better more quickly, great. But if you are trying to think about all the angles, I would take those things into consideration.
Okay, Rob, thanks so much for your comments and the analysis. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. These are really valuable for us internally because it forces us to really tighten in on some of these numbers. We hope it's of value to you. Again, if you have recommendations or specific things you'd like to see in these, please feel free to reach out to us. Do go to our website. Do make sure you're subscribed to our communications and do enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for being here.